Okay, so let me bring up this. If you're looking at your screen, this is Alexander Stevens, who was Vice President of the United States. He's famous for giving the so-called cornerstone speech, which stated early in the Civil War that slavery and the existence of slavery in the South was the cornerstone of the Confederacy. He tried to clean up that mess after the Civil War. But let me give you a little bit of background. I can't talk about all the rigmarole about slavery and abolition and the growing feelings against slavery. But let's just go, it's not rigmarole, by the way. It's one of the most important events in U.S. history. But let's just focus on the election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican candidate for president in 1860. The Republican Party was a very new party. It had just been established in the middle of the 1850s. It grew out of the ashes of the Whig Party and other what were called free soil parties. And a free soil party is a party that wanted to make sure that as the United States expanded, that the soil was free, i.e., that there were no slaves on it. And Lincoln's central plank, his central argument, his central political ideology, the glue that held Republicans together, because the Republican Party was a coalition party, was the absolute insistence that slavery would not expand into new territory in the United States. And I'll show you what I mean. Let's see. Okay, so I'm pulling up a map of the United States in 1850. Okay. And let's see. Let's see. Let me view image. And here's the thing that you might not realize. As late as look at 1850, if you can see this map, you'll see that much of the United States, what is now the United States, had not been settled yet. Some of this territory had just been captured from Mexico in 1848. Some of it had been purchased from France in 1803 as the Louisiana Purchase. And the point is that as late as 1850, even up until 1860, you had areas of the United States that did not have enough population to be considered states. You had to have a 50,000 person population to be a state. And so what you had in the U.S. was a vicious fight between pro-slavery proponents who wanted to move slavery in as much of the United States as they could, and anti-slavery proponents such as Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. Here's the key point about Lincoln. Lincoln was willing to let slavery exist where it existed when he was elected president in 1850, and it's the same states that show up in the when he's elected in 1860, and it's the same group of states that are slave states in 1850. There had not been a significant growth in slave states in the decade before that, which drove Southerners crazy. So this is one of the things that folks to this day don't understand about Abraham Lincoln. He was willing to let slavery exist for the time being in the states where it already existed, but he wanted to kill slavery by stopping it from expanding elsewhere into the United States as the population of the United States grew and as you had more states coming online. States such as Kansas, the Dakotas, Minnesota, New Mexico, Arizona. California had already come into the Union as a slave state in 1850 because it gained a population very quickly because of the gold rush. But there was still plenty of territory in the United States that was up for grabs. Would it be free in the sense that slavery was not going to move into these territories, or would it be slave? Now, Lincoln did hate slavery, although By our standards today, he could be considered racist. He did say during the Lincoln-Douglas debates that African Americans were inferior. So as often happens in history, the story is much more complicated than we get. To his credit, though, Lincoln did want slavery to die. He wanted to kill it, but he wasn't really willing, or he wasn't willing to go to war to kill slavery. His game plan for slavery was to contain it, to not let it expand beyond the states where it existed. And he believed that by containing slavery, you would put slavery on the road to what he called ultimate extinction. And that's his phrase, ultimate extinction. Now, he never said when slavery would end. Would it be 20 years? Would it be 50 years? Would it be 150 years? He never said. He was much too canny to say that. But he did believe that if you stop slavery from expanding into any U.S. territory where it didn't already exist in 1850 or in 1860, that it would die out at some point. So he's thinking long term. Okay, so when Lincoln is elected president, he tells Southerners, look, I'm not going to end slavery in the states where it exists. I'm not going to go to war against you guys. And I don't want you to leave the Union. I won't go to war with you unless you leave the Union. Southerners, on the other hand, felt like they could not live with Abraham Lincoln as a president, that they couldn't live with a man who was anti-slavery, who wanted to contain slavery in the United States. They knew that Lincoln did dislike slavery, although he wasn't going to kill it right away. And they kind of panicked. They had lost control over the White House in 1860, and slaveholders had controlled the White House up until 1860, from the writing of the Constitution until Lincoln's election. So it was kind of a peaceful revolution in 1860. But the South couldn't abide an anti-slavery president, even if that anti-slavery president promised, and he was quite serious, that he would not touch slavery where it existed. And in fact, he promised that he would pursue runaway slaves, slaves that ran away from the South into the free states. So again, Lincoln's thinking long term. 50 years, 100 years, he never said. But in the short run, Lincoln was not going to touch slavery. And so he's a much more complex figure than I think the public would believe. The public can't stand too much nuance. They just kind of want a black and white story. I'm not talking about race. I'm just talking about clear. The public's very uncomfortable with complexity. They basically want history to be a bedtime story that they can feel good about themselves and their nation's past so they can sleep well at night. Well, history's always more complex than that. Okay, so this is Lincoln's game plan when he's elected president in 1860. That he's not going to touch slavery where it exists, but he's not going to let it expand. Something else I want to stress. Slaveholders not only wanted to expand within what's now the United States, they wanted to expand into Cuba. Slaveholders had tried to buy Cuba in the 1850s. They wanted to expand into northeastern Mexico. The area south of Texas. They wanted to expand into Central America. So slaveholders not only wanted to expand into the U.S. territory that had not been settled yet, slaveholders also wanted to expand in the hemisphere. And they were quite aggressive about these calls for expansion. And they were also calling for the reopening of the African slave trade, which had been shut down in 1808 as part of the deal that was made when the Constitution was written. So slaveholders in the 1850s are very aggressive, and their language is very, very aggressive about wanting to expand slavery, not only in the United States, but in the hemisphere, especially in Cuba. But in 1860, there's a new president who comes in who's not going to kill slavery in the short term, but he believes that he can kind of suffocate slavery over the long term by not letting it expand either in the United States or anywhere in the Western Hemisphere.